Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Keylime Interactive and UXPA. My name is Anya Rodriguez, and I'm the CEO and founder of Keylime Interactive. I'll be your host this afternoon. Today's webinar is titled, It's Not Research, We're Getting Stuff Done. Now a word from our co-sponsor, UXPA.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jen Romano-Bergstrom, President of the User Experience Professionals Association. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to bring you this webinar, co-sponsored by Keylime Interactive. Thank you so much, Anya, and to the Keylime team for co-sponsoring this webinar with us. Our team recently met, the UXPA board recently met to discuss our 2016 goals, and one of our big goals for this year is to provide more resources to user experience professionals, and these webinars are one way that we're doing that. So we're really excited to provide these to you, and we're working on other resources to bring to our members and to professionals this year. We're also working on improving brand consistency and improving the international in UXPA. So we're aiming to bring more resources that are also more international, more translated material. We have lots of other resources, including our magazine and our journal, and of course our conference, which is coming up just right around the corner in Seattle, May 31st to June 3rd. So please check out our website and the conference website for more information about both of those. We're excited today for this webinar. Charles and Leo are actually teaching a course at the conference. So this is your sneak peek to their material, and you know, if you're interested, definitely check them out at the conference. So without further ado, thank you, Charles and Leo, and I will turn it back to Anya.
Great, thank you, Jen. So a little bit about Keylime for those that are not familiar with Keylime. Keylime is a research firm that conducts both qualitative and quantitative research. Our superpowers, our strategy, basically usability testing, and then we have our syndicated reports that do benchmarking and competitive analysis into a number of industries. Next slide, please. So today with me, I have two phenomenal gentlemen, Leo and Charles. Leo has about 40 years of experience. He was one of the guys that began working in his day with computer technologies and assembling his first computer in 1967. He's formalized his approach to design research, the process he calls Presumptive Design, which is what we're going to be hearing about today. He's been a product design manager at Intel, and he now is the founder of Phase 2, a visioning strategy, architecture, and design firm that serves small to medium enterprises. Charles is a UX researcher and designer at Intel, a corporation. His background and his superpowers is in research methods, judgment and decision making, and usability engineering. A couple of things before we get started today. During this session, you might notice on the right-hand side, there's a little chat window. If at any point you have a question, feel free to add it there. As you're experiencing any kind of issues with audio or whatever the case may be, you may also post it there. We invite you to follow this conversation as well via Twitter. If you could kindly use the hashtag KLI events, then we can answer questions via Twitter as well. With a lot of time at the end for the Q&A, we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. If we don't, then I'm sure my friends here, Leo and Charles, would be happy to answer some of your questions post the webinar. And so with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Leo, I'll turn it over to you and Charles.
Thanks so much, Ani, and thank you, UXPA and also Keylime for co-sponsoring the webinar today. So this is Leo Frishberg, and I'm co-presenting with Charles. Charles?
Hello. Hi, everybody.
So let's get into the topic and give you a little sense of what we're going to cover in the next 40 to 50 minutes. As discussed on the abstract that was sent out, we're going to focus on what the problem is. What's the problem with Lean UX, Agile, DevOps, and how does PRD fit within those development environments? We're going to zoom out a little bit, give you some context about where PRD fits in design frameworks and design thinking frameworks, and what the implications are of how we've kind of turned some of those ideas on their head, And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between artifacts and prototypes, since that seems to be a big issue that's interwoven throughout all of these conversations. So it seems to us that our projects are all getting squeezed for time. Some of our biggest fears, about Agile, and we've, I've been participating in Agile UX since 2008, and I remember the UXPA conference, at that time the UPA conference, where I was on a panel talking about Agile UX, and there was quite a bit of conversation at that conference about how Agile was actually not enabling UX, but in fact, because of it squeezing the time out of projects, was in fact causing problems. And now with the promise of the lean startup and of course lean UX, the promise is that we're going to get to the right solution by offering working code as soon as possible. But we've noticed that many of these approaches run into problems if the team isn't actually aligned on the right problem in the first place. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that manifests itself. Charles.
Yeah, so this is an analogy that we use in the book. So for us, this is a picture of the typical software project, right? In a typical software project, what the team is going to deliver has really already been decided by the time the team gets going. And this today is, to a large extent, reinforced by Agile, which focuses on execution and really assumes you already know what the right thing to build is, right? Agile is a developer-led movement, and it kind of shut design out of the picture. The Agilist wants a North Star handed to the team by someone outside of the team, by a sponsor or a stakeholder, and the result is that no one really questions the etiology of that decision. What lies behind it? What understanding is it based on? What vetting has been done on why that decision was made? So teams get going and they start having different conversations of tactics, really. We know waterfall is bad now, right? So we need to go Agile. The most popular Agile methodology by far is Scrum. Are we really Agile, or are we just doing mini waterfall? Should we be doing guerrilla usability or discount usability testing each sprint? Should we be starting with paper prototypes? What's this lean UX thing I keep hearing about? But notice that all of these debates that teams engage in are really about the best way to get to the top of a certain hill. And in presumptive design, we call that hill climbing. They're already in solution space, debating what's the best way to build the solution that they assume they're going to build. In presumptive design, however, we explicitly ask teams to zoom out and stay in the problem space. And the point is not to refine or improve a decided on solution, but to ask, why are we solving this problem in the first place, right? This isn't tactical, this is strategic. What is the landscape around the presumed hill? Why are we running this path instead of other paths? What if there are other, better, more profitable hills to climb? That's really how you innovate, right? What are the team's assumptions that they're making in solving this problem, and to what extent do they actually line up with how the users think about this problem? Leo?
Yep. So that's the fundamental distinction that we make with presumptive design, what we refer to as PRD, from some of these other Agile-like methods, because presumptive design is a very Agile method. It uses a lot of the same approaches to rapid iterations and moving through a design thinking cycle quickly, focused on what the problem is as opposed to how to best execute on a solution. So let's give you some other, let's zoom out semantically now and give you some idea about where PRD fits within a larger landscape. And to this, we're indebted to Liz Saunders and PJ Staffers in their fabulous book, The Convivial Toolbox. And with their permission, we were given the opportunity to overlay where presumptive design fits in their, what they call the emerging landscape of research methods. So presumptive design fits near the top. It's a design-led approach. It has one foot in the generative design research, participatory design process off to the right, and it has another foot in the critical design, cultural probes kind of area. And we'll get into a little bit about how it distinguishes itself from some of those other methods. But this gives you a sense from at least a design research framework how it's situated. Similarly, in the Akano and Fong quadrant, again, they were kind enough to allow us to position presumptive design in their phenomenology. You can see where it fits. Again, it's a very qualitative approach, and it's really focusing on goals and attitudes around the problem that users might be facing. We also like to situate it within the UK Design Council's double diamond diagram, which came out a few years ago, and it seems to be a fairly well accepted view. And as Charles was mentioning, you know, there's a trigger, there's an intention that generates a set of divergent processes, kind of following along the Paul Lassault notion of divergent convergent design thinking. So in that left-hand diamond, there's a divergent process, then a convergent process which says, hey, what have we figured out? What do we want to actually, what do we think the problem is? Then we make a decision to proceed on that project, at which point we enter a second phase of divergent ideation to think about all the possible alternative solutions and designs, and then ultimately we have to deliver something, so we converge again. Now they focused their diagram on the actual design thinking process. We also believe it sort of zooms out and talks about, in general, a new product introduction or a new product development process. So with that as the background, our last design framework is a pedigree of Chuck Owen, Vijay Kumars, and Steve Sato, all of whom are out of the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology, taking originally Chuck's diagram, in which the x-axis stretches from knowing things on the left to making things on the right, and the y-axis starts at the, stretches between acting in the world versus reflecting. And that model was embellished by Vijay Kumar and then ultimately Steve Sato. And we've overlaid now our terms that are, again, a derivation of the UK Design Council. So you can see how these different quadrants map to that double diamond. But traditionally, we will start in the lower left quadrant through a discovery method that's acting to know. It's acting in the world to know things. And then move up into a definition, or what Sato called framing. And that's where we find meaning in that data that's acquired. And then we shoot over to the design side, in which we do conceptualization and ideation. What does that meaning entail? We're on the making side now, but making in a fairly thought experiment sort of way, conceptualization. And then we ultimately come down and do the hard work of instantiating those concepts into designs. And we go through that process, we iterate that process as frequently as we can. So that's the traditional view. But in presumptive design, what we do is we kind of turn that model on its head. We don't change the axis orientation, we simply change the starting position. So rather than starting with discovery, we actually start by crafting artifacts. And that has some fairly important implications with how we go about doing our work. And so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to get into the implications of what happens when you start with artifacts. So to help make that distinction, I'm going to differentiate presumptive design from some of these other techniques that Charles introduced us to and that you're all aware of, hopefully, by situating them again within the double diamond diagram. So as Charles mentioned, and as we've been discussing, PRD really is in that left-hand diamond. It's focused on the strategic question about what is the right problem to be solving, and can we rapidly figure out what that problem is and better understand that problem space. On the left-hand side, you can see there's the notion of cultural probes, which for those of you who are not familiar, this was a seminal work produced by Bill Gavers and team back in 1999, in which they went out with to constituents, end users, participants, individuals, and offered them artifacts. And in so offering them, were provoking them to talk about the culture in which they existed. And these artifacts were very ambiguous. In fact, by design, extremely ambiguous. Postcards that showed dreamlike landscapes, maps of places that may not actually be places on the planet, cameras to take daily photo log diaries of things they were doing. And through collecting this information, the researchers and designers were actually looking for inspiration for what kinds of problems made sense to address. So cultural probes actually fall outside of the double diamond diagram because they're really inspiring teams to come up with an intention. And on the very far right, where we get to usability tests, those are by design intended to reflect on the work that has been completed. So again, those fall outside the diamond. And then on the left-hand side, again, as Charles mentioned, there's a variety of techniques that are out there right now to very rapidly iterate and very rapidly move through potential solutions. Certainly Lean UX talks about doing that. And in their book, they do say, look, you may in fact end up in a place that's fundamentally not the right place. So they do acknowledge that it's possible through the Lean UX process to actually identify that you're solving the wrong problem. We submit that would be a little late for certain organizations to discover. Above that in the diagram is the Google Ventures Design Sprint, and we recently chatted with them about that, and some of the folks who helped build that process agree that it is not about better understanding the problem. It's about very rapidly coming to a creative and potentially disruptive solution to an existing problem. And then again, rapid prototyping. We'll talk a little bit about the overloading of the term prototyping in a minute. So by putting this agile, rapid process in the problem space, and by starting with an artifact first, there are a number of implications in terms of how we get our work done, possible risks, and so forth. But I want to turn it over to Charles at this point to kind of illustrate what the differences are between this traditional view and the PRD view.
Sure. So in this view, we call this the waterfall UCD, or traditional user-centered design, right? Because in user-centered design, as it was traditionally conducted, you started with upfront user research for a certain amount of time. And that research was conducted prior to then designing solutions intended to solve the problem identified in that upfront research phase. And this effectively siloed research from design in two ways. It created two kinds of gaps, where first, typically your user researchers are not the same people who then design the solutions that need to take that user research into account. And then also, because of this, there's a handoff involved and there's a gap in time. Well, with the gap in time, and also just due to the fact that you're handing something off, whenever you have to summarize and hand off information, you're going to lose information. So there's kind of a diminished insight there because of that. And not to mention that since you're doing these activities separately, it's going to take longer. In presumptive design, we deal with this siloing, we deal with this gap, and also the increased time by coupling research with design. As the model showed earlier, we start with design and treat design as the vehicle for user research, where you're really not trying to refine a design at this point, but are exposing and capturing the team's assumptions about the problem they're solving and about the users they'll be designing for, and you're capturing those assumptions in a physical artifact and then using that artifact as a catalyst with real end users to explore their mental model, their understanding of the problem, their needs and frustrations and goals. And this is done collaboratively with, if you have user researchers separate from designers, and then even developers on the software team, they should all be there in these sessions, collaboratively absorbing the culture of use and hearing how the users talk about the problem and seeing firsthand how the user reacts to the artifact in their actual context of work. So there is no handoff. There's no, we kind of compare it to the game of telephone, where you whisper something in one person's ear and then they whisper it in the next person's ear, and what comes out at the end of the game is always a little bit different than what was originally said. This gets rid of that effect.
So embodied in all of this discussion is this notion of starting with design. And in starting with design, this raises some very interesting challenges. First of all, some of you may be saying, wait a second, that's the way we're already working. We're already starting with a solution and we're going out into the world, potentially, Lean UX says start with something and get quick user feedback. Why is this any different from that? And it's very, very different. And the reason it's different is that what you're starting with are the hopes and dreams and aspirations of your internal team. Now, for those of you in agencies, it might be your internal agency team, but it's very likely it's your client team who's come to you with a design brief and potentially with a quote problem. You may question that problem, but not have enough data to know whether it's the right problem or not. And so the very first step we suggest in PRD, or that PRD demands, is that you make manifest, you instantiate that problem as an artifact. And built into that artifact are all of those assumptions that your design brief or that your whoever triggered the intention, whether it's the highest paid person's opinion or whether it's your client or whomever, you embody that assumption, those sets of assumptions, into an artifact. And then you take that artifact out into the world and go to your constituents, in this case the users who would be impacted by that quote design, and get feedback not on the solution, but on the assumptions behind that solution, which means that we're talking about a very different kind of artifact from what has been traditionally, or at least historically, called a prototype. So Charles, walk us through a little bit of that.
Well, sure. So some of you might be familiar with Jared Spool's articles on this topic. So one of the things he's been talking about lately is how prototype has become kind of this loaded, ambiguous term. And he suggests that we kind of use that double diamond that we were talking about earlier to make this term less ambiguous. And the way he goes about it is that if you are in the left side of the diamond, he suggests you use the phrase artifacts, whereas if you're on the right side of the diamond, he suggests you use the phrase deliverable. So what that boils down to, in a nutshell, is that regardless of fidelity, if the prototype you're creating is an intended representation of the final solution, whether it's low fidelity or high fidelity, then he would call that a deliverable. And iterating on that and testing that is to improve and refine the final intended solution. Whereas if you are still in problem space and you mock something up, that's not the final intended solution. It's more like a sonar blip where you're using it to explore the landscape and expose people's assumptions and test what the reactions to it would be like. It's a very different activity, and it's a very different exercise, regardless of fidelity, because we often get it hung up on whether something's low fidelity or high fidelity, and really these different goals can be served with both low and high fidelity, and we typically prefer low fidelity artifacts for other reasons. They're cheaper, they can be tested just as easily, and they tend to not communicate to the user that this is the direction the team wants to go in. They look low fidelity because it's a half-baked idea, as Jared Spool would say. And so in the book, we use the analogy that we call rocks versus ripples, right? So even when we start with paper prototyping, even low fidelity paper prototyping, often we are talking about rocks where you're iterating that design to improve the design itself, to uncover usability issues and address them and refine that design. So we call that focusing on the rock. Whereas in presumptive design, staying on the left side of the double diamond, you are focusing on the ripples. You really don't care about the design itself. You're using it as a provocation. And then you throw that rock into the pond. And once you throw it into the water, it's gone, right? You're more interested in the ripples it creates. You're more interested in what it does to the user's work context and the assumptions it airs, and how it helps you see the user's mental model and how it might align or not align to the project team's mental model. So it's a very different goal, again, regardless of fidelity, whether you're refining an intended design or you're just sacrificially offering up that design to see what the reaction will be like, and then going and creating something else based on what you learn. That's often something we, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's one of the things we talk about in the workshop and that folks have a chance to try out. One of the key challenges and implications of this artifact first approach and the notion of an artifact versus prototype is that your design team may not be familiar with doing this. In fact, in our conversations with designers over the last several years, there's a real need to sort of grip and hold on to the design, meaning they really want to build and design a solution, and they're very concerned about putting their best foot forward, as they should be, with respect to designing a solution. But it's too early for that. And so recently in a workshop, we came to the conclusion, the attendees and I came to the conclusion that really the design effort that's going on in these early artifact creation sessions, what we call the creation sessions, or you might call them an alignment workshop or a vision workshop, but during those sessions with your client, the designer's role is not to design the solution. Your designer's role is to design the interaction that will occur when the artifact is presented to end users. It's really around designing that engagement session that comes later. What can go into the artifact to help provoke the right kinds of conversations? What kinds of assumptions can be built into this artifact that the user can react to? Very, very different design problem. Equally engaging, equally interesting, but it does require shifting your design teams to think a little differently about their skill set in these early stages. Charles, were you going to say something else?
Oh, I was just going to add that this helps teams really iterate, because often in Agile projects today, you end up focusing on incremental development without actually iterating. And that's, even just from an Agile point of view, that's not good, because Agile is supposed to be both iterative and incremental, but it tends to just be incremental, where you're just adding features each release to what was already built without ever really revisiting your overall direction.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit. Hopefully that's given you a fairly bit of a tease, if not some deep insights into both the differences between presumptive design and other sort of artifact first methods or other Agile methods in the UX space, and also some of the implications of starting with design. And there's plenty more, and of course we have this very large book and it goes into extraordinary detail in lots of places about that. In addition, in the workshops we spend some time really looking at assumptions and understanding how to tease those out and how to make those into artifacts. So there's lots of landscape there to investigate. But one of the questions that comes up a lot in our conversations is, when should we be using presumptive design and when shouldn't we? Because it's not a panacea, it's not a tool, it's just one tool in a bunch of tool in a toolkit, right? So we're very careful to isolate it or make it, put it in the context of when it should be used. So Charles, if you'd walk us through that process, that'd be great.
All right, so David Snowden calls this the Cynefin framework. And I guess he is a Welsh scholar, and Cynefin is a Welsh word that it means haunt, kind of like if you frequent an establishment, it might be one of your favorite haunts. So he has this framework. It's a 2x2 matrix where he starts with known knowns, and then in the bottom right goes up to known unknowns, to the left unknown unknowns, and bottom left unknowable unknowns. And the idea is that different kinds of problems will tend to reside or have a favorite haunt that will be somewhere different in the matrix. So at the bottom right, known knowns, the model here is to sense, categorize, and respond. Here you can build models. This is, Snowden says this is the cell of the matrix here is how bureaucrats tend to see the world, where every problem is a problem of process, and we just need to implement a process and that will fix the problem. The problem is that only works if you really are in this cell, and it's hard to know what cell you're actually in.
Yeah, Snowden calls this the simple cell, and then he talks about the fact that cause and effect are clearly understood. And these are processes that often can be automated. I mean, they're so mechanical that it's often easy to automate some of these processes.
Yeah, so here in the known unknowns, the relationship between cause and effect is still understandable, but it's less directly observable, it's less clear, and maybe a little more nonlinear. And here the model is sense, analyze, respond. You see, my screen's blocked by that thing there. So here, what you are looking to do is to bring experts in, to build expertise into this domain, and then use the advice of the experts to arrive at a best course of action. So here we're moving, at the top left, we're moving from the right to the left side, and things become even more complex, where you really cannot clearly identify clean cause and effect relationships. Things are definitely less deterministic and more probabilistic. The model now is probe, sense, respond. And Snowden makes the distinction that moving from the right to the left, you're no longer really looking for fail-safe procedures. You're now more on the side of safe-to-fail experiments. All you can do is conduct a probe and see what happens, and then adjust accordingly based on the effect of the experiment conducted. And then at the bottom, you move from the complex to the chaotic, where the model is act, sense, respond. There is no clear, identifiable cause-effect relationship, and everything that you come up with will be a novel practice. This is, what businesses often refer to as disruption.
And Snowden talks about that upper left as being, the purview of battlefield commanders who are facing kind of an unknown situation. They may bring a whole bunch of voices in and throw spaghetti at the wall, just try things, see kind of how, what happens if we try stuff. And in trying it, we might get a better insight and sense of what's happening in the world to reduce it to a known unknown or potentially a known known. So by decomposing it, they may move it into problem spaces that have easier resolutions. Whereas he talks about in the chaotic space, the lower left corner, this is the realm of fascists. This is where people just come in and dictate what needs to happen because there is no room for and no time. There are existential threats. This is truly acts of war. And so, you know, this is a place where you just need to take control and do something. So we submit that presumptive design is, what did you say, Charles, a safe experiment?
A safe to fail experiment, yes. So
go ahead.
Safe to fail, yeah. So here, there is no identifiable best practice. All you can do is conduct an experiment and see what the result is. So with presumptive design, again, you're building your assumptions into artifacts and then sacrificially offering those artifacts to see what the response is and using that as the catalyst for user research. And you know, you're in a complex environment, you're wanting to move quickly, so the idea is that you would turn this over as quickly as possible. And instead of doing this a bunch of times, you would do this with only several users really, and then create another artifact and do it again. And you'll quickly arrive at a point where what you're doing resonates more and more with the users. And you can start arriving at a good candidate solution as your understanding of the problem space grows. So this, as you experiment in this space, it's similar to some of Nielsen's stuff about usability, but with a very different goal, right? So where Nielsen says that it's better to conduct more tests with fewer users than fewer tests with larger sample sizes, that holds true here, but the goal is different, right? Because you're not trying to refine the design, you're just offering it up to see what, as a probe, to see what the response will be, and then you're using that as your vehicle for gathering information about the user population.
And so we submit that almost any endeavor in which innovation is going on, whether it's on software, which, you know, Agile talks about the software development process as managing complexity. And so in the reason Agile exists is because a simple requirement or even a user story is fraught with unknowns. And even the whole point being that if you're building product that doesn't exist in the world today to satisfy this user story, you are by definition in this upper left quadrant. And so that's why presumptive design has a really nice fit with software exploration and products that are actually exploring future-leaning ideas. And it works easily well with hardware, of course. The point being is that if you're inventing the future, which is what a lot of the organizations are that we've been working with, that's a very risky proposition. And so what's the best way to reduce the risk of inventing the future is test it. And so we talk about these artifacts as being artifacts from the future. And they are the safe to fail kinds of experiments. We craft these artifacts as literally future-leaning experiments and run them so that our participants, ultimately the users who would be impacted by our ideas, have an opportunity to get a feel for them. And so we bring the future forward in that sense. And there's some very interesting conversations we've been having with folks about time travel and what happens when you bring a product, you know, an artifact from the future back in time. And one of the things we've discovered is that it actually gets degraded, right? Time travel is pretty hard on artifacts. And so that's why these artifacts end up being maybe a little rough and maybe a little ambiguous, right? So that's the sort of humorous take we're taking on that. So at this point, I think we're open to questions and welcome any. I haven't been able to track the questions. Anya, are there questions sitting out there? Great.
Great. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Charles. That was really, really great. We have a couple questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first one. The first question we have, it says, you framed this approach as qualitative. How many users do you test artifacts with?
Charles, I don't have this backup slide for that one, but I'd love for you to address that since we do spend some time in the book on that very topic.
Well, right, that's what I saw that question, and that's what I was kind of throwing that answer in earlier about, was that it's similar to Nielsen stuff, in that you want to turn the process over more with fewer people than spend more time on a certain artifact running more users, right? Because there's the problem of diminishing returns. If you talk to 3 people and the second person does some of the same things that the first person does, and then the third person does some of the same things that the first person and some of the same things that the second person does, you're learning less and less each time you do this, right? You're not trying to generalize to some kind of population statistic. You don't need to talk to 50 people to get an estimate of a population mean. You just want to quickly pulse what the reaction is, rework the artifact, and then keep going, right? And you're not refining the artifact because that's the intended solution. You're reworking it to explore different aspects of the problem that you think the team is going to solve before moving into solution space. In solution space, it would be more like traditional paper prototyping. We're now iterating to improve the candidate solution, identify usability issues, and fix them prior to even moving into code. So there's no quantitative rule of how many people you need to run. In the book, we say that you should do this until you run out of time, you run out of money, or you're no longer learning anything new. And since this is such a cheap method, you're probably not going to run out of money if they're willing to fund this at all. You're probably going to you stop learning new things first, and then at that point you pivot.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you don't, you can't give a hard number, but you know it when it's happening. As Charles intimated, certainly we don't like to do anything fewer than 3, as the first couple are always going to be apparently idiosyncratic. But even at 3, it's a little dicey because you may not be getting a central tendency of response yet. By 6, you should have heard most of the stories and most of the concerns. You might be getting outliers, but still you've got a good central constellation of stories that have been told to you that you can then codify and begin to better understand. And that's, the other thing I like to say is that if you're making a $10 million bet on inventing a future, I would hope that your leadership is not going to just spend a few $1,000s on a tool like this, right? That this might actually help them line their camera sites up, but there should be additional quantitative work that goes on, informed by the signals, as Charles mentioned, the sonar blips, that this helps distinguish. And if you're in a startup and you don't really have a choice, well, this is one of the cheapest things to do to validate what you're thinking the problem is. So that may be all you'll be able to do. But at least it's faster, cheaper, and more immediate than diving into an entire lean UX, get the code out there kind of process.
Right. And I know, I appreciate that's not always the most satisfying answer, because we've gotten used to a clean answer to that, right? There's stuff like the 5-user assumption, and people are hungry for an answer akin to that. But what we need to keep in mind is that even that statistic, even that finding has been debunked. So I think we should be leery of people making answers to questions like this that oversimplify the issue.
Got it. Okay, great. Now we have the next question. Can you give an example of PRD?
Oh, yeah, sure. So in the book, and I do have a couple of, let me just see what slide number that is. Yeah. So, so in the book, we have several case studies, and I saw that Steve Portugal was on one of the attendee there. So Steve, if you're still on, hello, and thank you. Steve is one of the contributors to the book. We have about 10 case studies, and what I'm going to very, very quickly show you are 3 classes of artifacts, right? 3 examples that represent 3 completely different types of artifacts that you might expect to use in a presumptive design exercise. In the first case, this is what would appear to be a pretty straightforward paper prototype, a bunch of squiggles, some rectangles. There's some immediate interpretation of these as, maybe data graphs on a screen or multiple screens. This is an example of using essentially a pseudo solution as a prompt or a pseudo solution as a provocation. This was intended to be an out-of-box experience for a radically new service that was going to be provided to a specific industry. And this screen plus one other was offered to the informants, to the folks in the engagement sessions with us, the users, to react to and to use. And we had specific tasks that we wanted them to accomplish, but mostly we offered this to them and said, go ahead, this is the first thing you're going to see when the system is installed. And as a result of this and the other screen, the business actually was able to reconsider aspects of their entire business model. Because after 6 or 8 users went through this, they learned an awful lot about how disruptive they were being. Disruptive to the point that their timelines for introduction, their go-to-market strategy, but even their entire how should we lead, what should we start our service with, was called into question. So it's a very, very profound impact, even though it is what looks like a fairly traditional paper prototype of a pseudo solution. That's one class, and that's very common. It's very often the case. A second class goes way outside, and this is a case in which a technology team said, hey, we've got this great new technology and we think users are going to love it. We think they can create their snap together experience just by using all these parts and pieces. Well, rather than creating some kind of set of wireframes or paper prototypes with all the little parts and pieces, we boiled it down to the key question, and that was, what will people do when faced with relatively isolated modules that they are permitted to or are enabled to put together to support their outcome. So this was based on using some plastic Easter eggs and an egg carton, and going out into the world with this and offering. First of all, the process was, tell us a story about recently when you were working with somebody else in your organization, and then they told that story, and then we said, okay, great, go ahead and show us how these eggs could support that story. And what we learned was pretty profound. A lot of key questions that the technologists had thought were assumptions were in fact being called into question by the results of this study, and we had to go back to them and say, your technology stack is great because it allows for that snap together thing to happen, but it doesn't answer a whole lot of other questions about how these things should behave when they are snapped together, and your technology stack doesn't address that. And that certainly was the key concerns by the users who were playing with this artifact. So clearly this artifact is not in any way a rendition of an ultimate solution, but it does render the key assumptions that were part of the offering. So the third class is a class of objects or a class of artifacts that do ultimately transform into the final solution. This one happens to be by Chris Stapleton, in which he was working with people with aphasia. And he was working with therapists in that context. And what he did was kind of out of the blue, sort of came up with this idea of offering these patients or these people a box of things that they could tell stories around. And his initial box was not very well considered, but he really offered it as a provocation just to see if that would be a different way of approaching the therapeutic session. And over time, first of all, they realized it was a hugely successful experiment. And so, it's one of those cases in which an experiment, while safe to fail, this one probably failed in a lot of ways he doesn't talk about, but it succeeded so well at the core that he was able to then evolve it and ultimately create a set of very, sublime kinds of artifacts that inspired these people with aphasia to actually start telling stories, which was the transformation of the therapy. So 3 classes, the first one being your typical sort of pseudo solution in a paper prototype type idea. The second one being a completely abstract artifact that at least addresses, at minimum addresses the assumptions of the problem space. And then this third one, which is the seed of the solution, which, you know, sometimes you're lucky and it actually does become the ultimate solution.
Okay, we got a lot of questions that have come in now, so I'm trying to figure out which was next here. All of a sudden I had like 30 questions coming at once, so here it goes. How does this early phase of presumptive design differ from the standard brainstorming exercise with all disciplines of a team present, or a kickoff workshop with those clients' agency disciplines present?
I'll take the first stab at this, Charles. We hear that quite a bit, right? And so we don't in any way say that it's different from that kickoff brainstorming session. In fact, you know, chapter, I think it's 15, the creation session, you know, pretty much starts out saying, look, you're probably already doing some kind of alignment session with your clients, right? It's very, very crucial at the start of every project. But go back to that problem statement versus solution issue. Is the client bringing you a brief and you're brainstorming about possible ways to address the brief? Or are you now brainstorming about the brief itself, and to what extent is the brief called into question? That second one is not generally one we hear people doing, right? Specifically in the agency-client relationship, very rarely are we hearing agencies questioning the client's brief at the start of the project. And so what presumptive design says is, don't question your client, and don't question your hippo, and don't question the problem as stated. Embrace it, even if you do internally have questions because you think best practice suggests it's the wrong way to go. But embrace it and brainstorm about the assumptions, get those assumptions out, and brainstorm about an artifact that can embody those assumptions. And the biggest challenge in that kind of creation session is to keep people from going too far down the road in terms of a solution. So, you know, that it's not different in terms of the kinds of exercises you might do in that alignment or a creation session, or brainstorming or kickoff or ideation. Lots of the same exercises. In fact, we don't offer a lot of those exercises in the book because there's so many great resources out there to do that. But there are 2 key differences. The first difference is we accept at face value the problem as stated, and we simply are trying to instantiate and articulate that problem in an artifact. That's an interesting challenge. And the second one is we go out quickly, like the next day or within a week, in front of your clients and users with that artifact. And that's where we find a lot of raised eyebrows, at least from our consultants and agency clients, who are kind of going, whoa, that's different. So I don't know if that, you know, answers the question. Charles, do you have anything to add?
Well, sure. So we like to say it's like a judo move, right? So you do similar things in the creation session, which is where you have the internal team, the internal stakeholders airing their assumptions, and you're capturing these assumptions, and you'll probably have different stakeholders with they're very vehement, and they think they know what the solution should be. And with presumptive design, instead of sitting and debating these things in meetings, you just say, that's great, yeah, that's a wonderful idea, let's mock it up. And then you move from the creation session to the engagement sessions, and instead of arguing with the stakeholders, or Leo said the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, you just immediately have them come along and see their assumptions tested, and it will usually show them firsthand the ways in which their assumptions were wrong. So that's how it's different. You're not coming to conclusions in some kind of kickoff meeting or brainstorming session. You are using it to capture their assumptions, and even if you disagree with them, instead of debating it in a meeting, because really it's an empirical question, you just capture it and you go test it immediately. Not the solution again. You're trying to test their assumptions.
Got it. Okay, we are nearly 1 minute to the end. I have one question that came up several times, and maybe if we could just quickly answer as best as you can. It talks about the roles of people, and it says, does the researcher slash UX designer then become the leader of discussions with the Agile team when a project is proposed? I know basically they're asking who participates in PRD and what are the roles.
So very quickly, and we talk about this at length in the book, we look for a diversity on the team, and by diversity we mean diversity of thinking as they sit in those quadrants of the design thinking model that we've talked about. So yes, whoever takes the lead on the project may often be a researcher, but could be a designer depending on their skill set. It doesn't really matter who's taking the lead, but recognize that there are these different kinds of thinking or ways of thinking. Folks who are like analysts, again, these are names, and they could be job roles, but mostly we've just given them names to sort of indicate where their center of gravity is with respect to their comfort around design, around the design thinking framework. So yes, researchers and observers, right, clearly are the folks who are going to be out there listening hard during the engagement sessions. They have a different role potentially in the creation session. Analysts, again, listening and making meaning from the comments and stories that are being told. Designers, they play a role in both the engagement and the creation session. They bring that synthetic, conceptualized way of thinking. And of course, it's great to have builders who can ground these ideas in laws of physics so that when ideas come back from the engagement sessions, the builder can go, well, we can't quite do that, but we can at least do this, and they're brought along in the process. So again, we do spend some time on this in the book. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think with that, it's time for us to conclude today's webinar. We want to thank you, Leo and Charles, for such a great presentation and such insightful slides, and congratulate you on your book, as well as we're looking forward to seeing you at UXPA. Again, I want to thank everyone who was here today, and this concludes our webinar for today. I wish everyone a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.